that so many solutions already exist, right? Of how to make better algorithms, how to bring in better design processes, how to get better at running or with the running of organizations, right? But then we also, right, what we've been discussing now is that why does a lot of it not happen? Yeah, and one way of looking at it is through this lens of political economy. So, what does political economy tell us? That it's basically the push and pull forces responsible for people and organizations to take the actions that they do, right? That with the understanding that who has the power to shape what actions are taken by other people, by managers within organizations, by designers, and so on. And what we saw last time was we basically looked at, as examples, we looked at the surveillance economy and the gig economy as two places to begin to understand why this is happening, right? So basically, what the way we'll do this part of the module is we'll first begin with understanding the why, and then we'll begin with understanding the how these processes actually work, and then finally we'll go to possible solutions, right? So that's where we'll talk about new concepts that are coming up these days, like platform cooperatives, digital commons, and something which has existed for a long time called appropriate technology, and how all of this applies to potentially changing the political economy. So within the surveillance economy, we saw that, and like we've seen in the past, right, that things like nudging to and advertising, the whole idea of doing customized advertising, how that is actually positioned. So essentially, it's about convincing people why advertising is good, that it generates relevant advertisements and so on, and it dismisses or doesn't consider into prominence the manipulation that all of this actually brings in. And why does this manipulation, why is it useful? Well, ultimately, right, so this is what Shoshana Zuboff has written extensively in her book, Surveillance Capitalism, right, where she talks about the process through which corporates use user data to understand and then potentially to even control user behavior, right? And all of it works in the operations start in areas which are not regulated. Right, so this is where we saw Zuboff's this concept that she calls incursion into private spaces, and then to habituate users with the tools so that they become less resistant to this incursion into the private spaces because they get benefits from all the tools that are coming into the picture. Right. Then in this case, we also saw that how the 9/11 event was very useful for the surveillance economy to grow into more prominence, because the state also needed these mechanisms to surveil citizens, right? And companies like Google were already amassing a lot of data, which will later on, right, the Snowden revelations essentially put a stop to it to some extent. But this is how the surveillance economy grew very quickly, because even regulation wasn't coming up quickly enough to curtail some of this privacy violations that had started happening. So this, of course, then leads to more profit for companies. When they start viewing people as consumers, they start understanding their behavior, and then they try to control the behavior as well, in terms of, right, by showing these advertisements, right advertisement at the right time. We've discussed concepts like triggering of impulses to buy, right? If this trigger comes at the right time, then it means that you're less likely to act upon it. So all of this was really mechanized through the increasing datafication that has been happening. Yeah. So that's what we saw about the corporate, right, role of surveillance for the corporates. And then we started talking about surveillance by the state and why is that considered to be useful. Right. So the state basically positioned it that it requires the surveillance to be able to control and coordinate populations in a better way. Right. And right, James Scott, it talks about it extensively of how the state sees the citizens, right? So they don't see them as citizens, but rather as populations, who's somebody who's identifiable, classifiable, describable, and therefore they can be controlled. And James Scott then talks about many schemes of how this the same logic of describing, making people legible so that they can be controlled. The right, all of these schemes have tried to do this, but also have not succeeded to a great extent. Yeah. So he talks about many things that we saw, monoculture in forests. Later on, he also relates it to the Soviet Revolution, agriculture mechanization and formalization, collapse of the Soviet Union. So in all of these, he's basically questioning when formalization is imposed from the top, then what happens? Right? So the state tends to impose this formalization by making populations legible so that they can be controlled, and all of this is done from the top, as opposed to it being more bottom up. And this often fails because the population is complex, right? People's motivations are complex, and it cannot be controlled so easily. The world is complex, and the issues with rationalization that we've seen, this is itself the main problem, that the world is complex, not everything can be described exactly. And that is why many of these schemes which impose formalization top down tend to fail, right? Rather, you need more bottom up systems so that informal systems formalize gradually on their own, right? So that's sort of the more appropriate way of doing it, and which we will study as we go along, right? So James Scott basically, through all these examples, he shows why this top-down imposed formalization often doesn't work, because it doesn't account for the complexity of the world. And it also, right now, very often to actually get it to work, it requires a lot of informal processes to emerge on the ground, and which it actually, this top-down formalization actually cannibalizes on. So that is why many of these schemes often fail. But the point is that why are these done? That's basically with this view of rationalism to impose structure in a top-down manner so that the world works in deterministic ways. So this is what is used by the state to essentially justify this, right? The top-down imposition, justify surveillance in this manner, right? Similarly, right, many other people have talked about it, right? So, right, we discussed a little bit of this last time. And similarly, right, even in the modern context with Aadhaar and so on, right, we're seeing exactly the same things being perpetuated, right? That is really an infrastructure which is making people legible, and so that you can control and coordinate the population. And but at the same time, we've seen so many examples of why this is inadequate, right? And that is exactly where we see that when these structures are imposed, it doesn't account for all the different complexities, all the different problems. So it leads to a lot of exclusion, right? As we've seen, problems that people face in, right, when biometrics fail and grievance redressal procedures are not available. So that's sort of what we've seen happening again and again. Right now, why is the state supporting it? One theory, of course, is that it helps the state control, right? But another view also is that many of these technologies, when they are making, they're giving a digital identity to people, that is actually making it easier for capital to bring these people into the formal capital market ecosystem, right? So for example, if people want loans, once they have a digital identity, once it's linked to a bank account, then it becomes easier for them to get loans through formal systems. And therefore, this provides an incentive for more of formal capital to flow into many of these rural markets, right? Because otherwise they were resorting to informal money lenders and so on. So this is one way in which capitalism, you can see, is trying to enter into new markets. So that's how capitalism frames it, that we are increasing the market. But actually what it is doing is that it is formalizing markets that were so far informal. And the problem with doing that, right? So there's pluses and minuses. Pluses are that once formal systems do come into the picture, they become easier. It becomes easier for the state to regulate them. But on the other hand, as we go on and we'll see more examples, right? The corporate enterprises can also prevent this regulation, right? Just like it was prevented in surveillance capitalism, and it grew to such an extent. So in the same way, the more markets you open up for money capital and for financialization, it makes them more and more powerful, and ultimately, right, giving loans, fueling consumption expenses through loans, that ultimately harms the poor, because they may end up taking you, if you make it very easy for people to take loans, it becomes harder for them to repay, and therefore it means that many of their resources can then be taken over by this capital, right? So this is what we also saw in the subprime crisis in the US, the 2008 financial crisis, where the poor, right, just because it became easy for them to get loans, they took up these mortgages and they weren't able to repay them, and they basically lost their homes. And all of these assets eventually came to be owned by people who had given this money capital, financial capital in the first place, right? So essentially, the point is that the state, of course, wants to control and coordinate, but at the same time, the mechanisms used by the state to control and coordinate, they also end up the same kind of formalization that is being brought, that also ends up helping capitalism to expand into more and more frontiers, because capitalism needs these formal structures to operate, right? So that's how many of these platforms have been scaling. Partly also, a lot of it is actually supported by the corporate itself, right? Platforms like Aadhaar and then other infrastructures built on top of it, like eventually like UPI. All of these have been supported by the corporates to be built and to be adopted and scaled. So you should read this article, right? This talks about exactly what we've been saying, that premature formalization of informal and small enterprises can actually hurt the poor. And it moves the market share towards organized market players. This is also what we're seeing happen in India with after demonetization and then with GST. And then even more because during the pandemic when informal enterprises were hurt more, right? Loans and everything were more easily accessible to formal enterprises, and therefore the formal enterprises have grown and at the cost of informal enterprises, right? But this often leads to more exploitative processes coming into play. And rather, a better way is actually to, in a bottom-up manner, to build the capacity of these informal enterprises to gradually formalize themselves, right? So there are these different ways to look at it. So just to summarize, surveillance capitalism is justified because the corporate want to understand and model consumer behavior so that they can exploit it further. Surveillance by the state is justified for control and coordination. And then the two also are interlinked together, because the more the population is formalized, the more easy it becomes for both capital and the state to work together, right, to expand, right, so that it leads to greater market expansion for capital. Yeah. So that's one of the constant strands that we see, that it's all very closely tied up with capital. Yeah. Right. One other interesting ramification of all of this that we were also discussing is that as a result, what ends up happening is that inequality is growing. It becomes harder for people to progress, to work on new opportunities, and at the same time, with right, if it becomes harder and harder for people to access welfare, then ultimately it leads to less faith, less trust in the government, and they begin to rather see politicians as their saviors. And right, so this is essentially what leads to an erosion of people trying to strengthen democracy. Rather, it leads to all of this clientelism by people cozying up with local elite or using politicians to try and get their benefits, and essentially it leads to more and more divisiveness in the population. So all of this is also greater surveillance by the state and so on, and imposition of top-down formal systems which ultimately don't end up working properly. This leads to less faith in the government, and it leads to an erosion of democracy itself, right? And democracy is what can actually set these things right by bringing in the right policies. But all of that, therefore, becomes more and more difficult. Yeah, right. So again, right. So several examples that we saw of all of this. Partly also what therefore this ends up doing is it puts more and more power in the hands of the bureaucracy, which is essentially the stakeholders that are imposing these processes, who are controlling these processes. Right. So it's the bureaucracy that ultimately becomes stronger and stronger. Right. So the rules to hold the system in place, the people who govern the system, right, they are the ones who end up gaining more and more power at the cost of citizens and everybody else, right? So Graeber also talks a lot about how ultimately you can even view these bureaucratic rules that are imposed as actually structural violence. Structural violence in the sense that it is actually these bureaucratic structures that end up forcing people to do things which are not really in their interest, and it makes it difficult for people to also stand up against these rules. That's what he calls structural violence by bureaucracy. So you can see how all of these systems of surveillance and so on, which are imposed, end up expanding markets for capital and end up making it harder for people to protest against it. It weakens democracies, it strengthens bureaucracy. So that's one way in which all of this works. Right, then if you look at the gig economy as another example, then here also we've seen that we've looked at how algorithms are used to control Uber drivers, for example, or similarly, right? And urban services like beauticians work to control workers through these algorithms, through rating systems and so on, right? So here also we see the same thing as operating. That on the one hand, these have formalized what was an informal economy. So drivers and many people view it as a means of earning higher income and earning better money. And the same thing is also seen in online outsourcing, online crowdsourced work, like labeling of for data for labor to generate labor data for machine learning. There is the right, just like Amazon Mechanical Turk, many of these platforms have come up which actually, right, that you can earn money by labeling images and so on, or writing transcripts for audio, which can help speech recognition systems. And right, so a lot of these such systems are coming up, and one way is to view them as that they're expanding the market, they're helping provide better income and opportunities to people, right? But at the same time, they're also exploiting people more and more, right? And so there are many of these such cases that initially heavy incentives were given to bring drivers onto platforms like Ola and Uber, but gradually these incentives were rolled back and drivers were caught in a debt cycle because they had taken loans to purchase vehicles, and so then they had to continue working for these companies just to be able to repay the loans, but their incomes had decreased substantially. And then it's not also that it encouraged it helped a lot of people to come up and to become entrepreneurs themselves. Rather, it was the same setup where earlier operators who had been running their own private taxi services, they basically got onto platforms like Uber and they kept most of the income. The drivers were basically just paid a pittance, right? Just like they were in the earlier days. So ultimately, what all of this ended up doing is that, right, exactly what we've been saying, that greater formalization, right, essentially helped more and more capital to flow, right? So more capital, more formal capital came into the market, more cars came onto the roads, but ultimately the mechanisms through which this was done was meant to control drivers, was meant to create more and more exploitation so that more returns could go back to this formal capital which had now come in, right? So it's not that it's really led to significant emancipation of the people, but it's now exploitation in a different form. Earlier, people were exploited by their right, local money lenders and so on. Now they are being exploited by commercial forms of the same system, right? So we see the same setup being echoed in the gig economy, right? So all of this now is now telling us, right, that it is actually the political economy, right? Platforms have strong incentives to do what they're doing, right? Because it's tied up with formal capital, it's tied up with a nexus with the state to operate together. And in the name of like generating more employment, generating more income, it is actually capital which is just increasing more and more markets in which it can work, and it is creating more of this exploitation. Right now, same thing we'll also look at when we come to social media. Now, all of these things are, however, called platforms, right? But we're seeing that there are these strange dynamics of exploitation which are actually operating behind the scenes. So this is a very nice paper by Tarleton Gillespie called "The Politics of Platforms." So where basically he says that why is the term platform used for such technologies? And basically says that the word platform has a very neutral connotation. Rather, it has something of an empowering connotation, that this platform becomes a way for people to do better things. And it's used in many different contexts for computation, architecture, and so on, right? But actually, what we see is that the platforms are operating in the way they are for a particular logic. and there is a particular agenda behind their algorithms, behind everything that the objectives that they follow, everything that they do, right? So it's actually a misleading term. It's a term which is neutral, but actually the operations are not neutral at all. Platforms and everything, yeah, right. And similarly, with right a similar kind of dynamic we also see with use of the term big data, right? So again, big data is projected as something, right, that you're now drawing correlations, you're uncovering new facts about the world, new knowledge, new relationships. But actually, the fact is that a lot of the conclusions that you might be drawing, the data is not reliable enough. There's a lot of missing data. So the claims to accuracy and objectivity could be misleading, right? They compare with other methods, what ethnographers use or how scientists design experiments. And right, so that again makes you wonder, why is big data touted up in such a big way? Right. So again, right here you see that it is actually right companies and everybody who are benefiting out of this notion of selling in the name of big data, that just because there is now a lot more data available, so you can do all sorts of new things, cool things, but actually it may not actually be valid. So again, right, we're seeing that there is this relationship between how things are marketed and projected, and but what they actually are in practice, right? We see the same thing for use of the term platform and similarly for use of the term big data. Now, similarly, we also see social media. Now, social media again is presented as platforms, right, which can lead to greater sharing of knowledge and help, right, give people power to start revolutions and help coordinate better and so on, right, for revolutions and various things, right? But again, what Fuchs argues is that again there are a lot of exploitative processes that are operating behind the scenes, right? So one of them that he talks about is basically just like platforms like Uber and so on exploit labor of workers, of drivers. Similarly, social media is exploiting digital labor of users. That ultimately it's all of us, right? All of us users who are sharing content, who are participating on these platforms, and it is this labor which ultimately is appropriated by the platforms for their own profit. Plus, these platforms also push and are shaped by the dominant capitalist logic in which they are embedded. So, right, so with Facebook, we saw things like early on, things like metricization, and there is a strong focus on individuals that we have to compete with each other for more popularity, for more likes, for more followers, and so on. And this is pretty much the essence of capitalism, that it tries to destroy cooperation and between people and solidarity between people, and rather to push more on individualism and competition. Similarly, at another level, we are seeing that social media also has this tendency where network effects lead to the emergence of monopolies. And that leads to some companies becoming very powerful and basically taking over the rest of the ecosystem, preventing new competition from emerging. Right now, the same companies also then talk about that now all of this data can really lead to a lot of social benefit. So they convince investors and governments about the use of the technology. And again, right, we've seen that this may actually be misleading, however, right? That actually there are exploitative processes operating behind it, but it's just being marketed in a different way. Even the notion of participation is very simplistic. That is actually not conducive to debate, right? And we've seen this, right? That platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on, they're not very conducive to debate, right? The more debate that happens, it actually leads to disengagement, it leads to uncivil behavior. So the design of the platforms should have been different, as we've seen with right various things on content moderation, where platforms like Reddit seem to be much better, where users are actually empowered to control the platform and to build institutions essentially. But platforms like Facebook and so on don't do it. However, they still say that they are very participatory, but actually it's a very simplistic notion of participation. So this way, Fuchs basically criticizes another contemporary philosopher, Henry Jenkins, who talks of this as participatory culture, right? But Fuchs says that this is a very simplistic notion of participation. right? That emergence of echo chambers is a manifestation of things not being participatory. Filter bubbles are a manifestation of exploiting the biases of humans. Right. Similarly, he also criticizes Manuel Castells. Manuel Castells, you might remember, we looked at his some of his ideas earlier, where he talks about how these platforms allow new power structures to emerge, right? But also social media structure, all this new power which emerges, that can also be challenged easily, because it also simultaneously gives to for people to watch over other people and to troll them, to suppress visibility of different forms of violence. Therefore, he says that social media in the current form is not that conducive, and this is why, right, some analysis has also shown that since social media platforms have come up, actually the protests, number of protests and so on, have actually gone down. The percentage of successful protests have actually gone down, because it's become easier for governments and different entities to suppress these protests. So all of this is basically again pointing towards the idea that the way platforms are projected, right, as being emancipatory and so on, it may actually not be the case, and rather there are all these different imperatives, right, economic imperatives and so on, affiliation with the state and so on, which might actually be driving this behavior. So Fuchs, right, so this book is actually very nice. It talks a lot. It gives you a very good summary of different social theories, and also talks about the relevance of media and communications, right? Because ultimately what we're saying is that the way to counter this ideology of surveillance, and right, to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes, that requires people to understand, that requires better communication structures, and it points to the importance of media as a means to educate people, right? But media itself is controlled. So that's why then folks basically says that, well, if social media is not the answer, then what kind of a media is actually the answer? So he comes up with some of these principles that he calls media counterpower, right? That it should be public media, grassroots media, right? Some public funding should be given to this. The staff need to have the power for critical journalism, investigative reporting. Consumers should also support this through donations, media regulation that secures quality, fair reporting, diversity, freedom of expression, assembly, alternative news sources, right? And ultimately also policies that that once media does bring up something, the policies support those principles from being, those observations from being addressed. Right. This, of course, then requires new forms of organization to also emerge, which can actually counter the dominant media discourse. Right. So now you can see how, right, once the way platforms are projected, right, once the only way to address that problem is by building better media systems, better communication systems, and these are some of the characteristics that Fuchs talks about that such media systems should have, and that social media alone is not the answer. Social media is probably just one step towards it, but it needs a lot more work to design it better, for it to work better, so that it can evolve into some of this. Yeah. So again, right, another point that Fuchs also talks about is that therefore it's not just media also, but also offline structures, right? So social movements, which are also very necessary, because online activism alone will not change anything. At this point, he refers to the Soviet Revolution and various other such social movements. So he's written other books also where he analyzes social movements, and basically criticizes Castell's idea that social media alone had such a transformative effect in building up social movements. Rather, he shows that actually offline activism is very important, right? So both these things, therefore, need to work together, right? New media structures to counter some of the narratives that platforms, the way technology is used, right? That kind of a narrative which is created, as well as offline structures and social movements, which then need to take all of this forward and begin challenging the exploitative structures themselves. Yeah. So ultimately, basically says that modern domination aims at the accumulation of money, economic power, decision power, which is political power, and reputation and definition power, which is cultural and ideological power, right? And all of these basically need to be challenged together, right? Accumulation of money, which is basically capitalism, accumulation of decision-making political power, which happens largely through the state and through bureaucracies, and reputation and definition power, right, of what are platforms and so on, and which is basically used to influence culture and ideology. And for this, you need better communication, better media systems. So you need to look at all of these things to really be able to, right? So coming back to our main argument of how do we make sure that technologies deliver more ethical outcomes, right? So the point is that while all the stuff that we've studied about building better user interfaces, fairness in algorithms and so on, all of that is very important. But to be able to act upon it requires us to challenge all of these different structures as well, because otherwise it can't be done, right? Otherwise, these solutions will just remain as right solutions, but not really get adopted for anything meaningful. So Fuchs also then relates it to Airbnb and other things, right? So you can go through the notes, but yeah, the principle is the same, that it leads to this exploitation and which is then misrepresented in the public sphere, right? So similarly, right, other examples that talk about these things, right? So now this aspect, right, of markets working together with the government, this has also been called neoliberalism. So neoliberalism, actually, the way the concept is projected is that the government should leave markets alone. The markets should be allowed to operate in a free manner, unhindered from any regulation, and they will shape through competition. The markets will shape things automatically, right? But actually, what we see is that markets. This is actually again, right, a misrepresentation that economists and others who support free markets, it's actually a misrepresentation, right? Actually, the markets influence governments a lot. They try to influence policy, for example, even by bringing in more and more services which the government has been providing, by bringing in more and more services into the private sector. And so that again, it opens up more and more market for capital. So neoliberalism, therefore, people like David Harvey call it a political project rather than it's not so much of an economic project. It's actually a political project because it's actually influencing right. It's giving a misleading representation of even scientific principles of how markets are supposed to operate, right? So Joyajit Paul talks about it in a very interesting way, that how do we see this nexus sort of between markets and the state? How do we see this nexus as operating in the development context, right? That how do companies and so on convince governments and similarly convince the public about how a better technology, right, or new technology can actually change development, can bring about development, even though actually the technology may not be very suitable, very appropriate. It may not be the solution, right? So here, right, he basically looks at how technology, especially, right, the IT revolution, how that's portrayed publicly in the media and by politicians and by bureaucrats, right? So he gives many examples, right? That positive portrayal of people working on computers, right, in the movies, right? So in the movies, you see, right, if people are, on the one hand, there is back-breaking manual labor. On the other hand, they see others working on computers, sitting in air-conditioned rooms. So naturally, it becomes an aspirational thing for the people, and it attaches a greater positive outlook towards IT work. Similarly, right, even misconceptions that people begin to understand. Hrithik Roshan used computers in Krish to become like a Superman. We can use computers to build buildings and also to protect ourselves from attacks, right? So again, right, even misconceptions that people learn through the media and essentially to glorify, valorize technology. Yeah. Similarly, in politics, right, many politicians also embrace technology, but failures of ICT projects do not get much coverage, right? So we've looked at the Bhumi project on land record digitization, and here we saw that even the reports were blocked and many of the results were presented in misleading ways, right? So ultimately, right, these kinds of things are put up in the promise of development, but actually it may not actually be leading to that much of benefit, but it's marketed in a particular way that leads to embrace of this ideology, right, of technology innovation and use of platforms and so on, while actually the right exploitative processes might continue to operate, right? So this is also what's called discourse analysis. So how do you see through this discourse? Yeah, right. So we've talked about Escobar several times, that even development and poverty, right? So it's seen that poverty exists, it needs to be countered, and technology can be useful for all of it, right? And it's actually the views of development that are imposed by the global north as what the global south should be aspiring for, right? So how does this discourse come into the picture, right? So this is called discourse analysis, and this particular paper takes an example of a speech by the head of the World Bank at that time, and basically analyzes the entire speech. Right. So here, right, these are various examples that some things that they're talking about is given by an expert. Right. So some person who is an expert, and I'm glad that she is here. Right. So these are where they identify that things like technocracy, things like persuasion, are used in the speech to actually convey these points. I want to thank you and my children. Thank you because of the very large salary I receive. Right. So all of this is being shown to legitimize that, okay, I am paid a very large salary. I'm the head of the World Bank and I know what I'm saying. Right. And that's why whatever I'm saying, people agree with it. And that's why I get this large salary. Right. So it's used to convey confidence, also partly through humor, but also to reinforce the authority that the person now commands. Then statistics are presented, right, which tend to convey greater truthfulness when such factual information is presented. You tend to think of it as more correct, more authoritative. Yeah. Similarly, right, allows you to achieve your objectives. So there is a tech optimism over here that this technology will help you achieve your objectives, whatever they are. Right. So you can go through this in more detail, right? But right. So you see many of these things being embraced, right? Corporatism, right? Role of corporates in all of this, role of technology and how to attach legitimacy. Similarly, right? Giving examples, right, of various places where these principles have been tried. So this is basically how discourse, right? How the discourse, right, through speeches, through articles in the media, how these issues are framed, that tends to perpetuate the views of platforms, essentially how technology can actually make the world a better place, right? But actually, because many of these counter views do not see as much of exposure, so it leads to people to believe and to aspire for use of similar technologies. Yeah, and essentially it entrenches these existing power structures, right? Because it's actually these speeches which make their way into the media, right? Governments write press releases. Many newspapers would just publish the press releases as such because it saves them costs from analysis, from any kind of critical analysis of this news. Right. So the media institutions, and many of them are also corporate run, so they essentially become instruments to perpetuate the same ideology, right, of technology excellence, technology determinism, and so on. Yeah. Right. Then, of course, I mean, there's also misinformation, disinformation that we've talked about a lot. Similarly, right, even in the case of technology, right, these similar things are done, right? So even in climate change and concepts like smart cities, we see the same things being talked about, right? The technology is going to solve the problems and so on. But rather, very few people are actually questioning, right, that it was actually a lot of inappropriate technology that got us here in the first place, right? Use of fossil fuels, use of cars, and so on. And had some of that been developed with greater consultation, right, it wouldn't have probably led to this kind of a situation. Yeah. So that's the whole idea, right, of how discourse can actually shape this, and even what is emphasized, and even disinformation can perpetuate many of these aspects, right? So these are all just more examples, right? So we talk about the digital divide, that providing the internet in rural areas, for example, will solve many of the problems, right? But we also see how many of these projects have failed, and in fact some of them, like providing e-governance services in rural areas. Now, technically these services are supposed to be free, like getting an income certificate, getting a birth certificate, and so on, being able to pay electricity bills, right? Now, technically these are free, but the way the whole setup of setting up internet kiosks in rural areas where people could come and get these services, but they actually have to pay a fees for it, right? The way it's justified is that once people start paying a fee, it will make these telecenters financially sustainable, right? But there's several problems, right? First of all, these services should have been free, right? The state should actually have set up these telecenters anyway to make these services more easily accessible to the people. Right? There's the same thing, same argument that we see with grievance redressal, that these services are not easily accessible, right? Even though people should have a right to access and use these services on their own at no cost, right? But rather, the way these projects basically were marketed is that we'll put up low cost internet connectivity in rural areas, we'll provide services through telecenters, and they will make them sustainable through a fees, right? So this itself was going against the principles of how these services should have been provided. Plus, many of these projects anyway did not work, right? Because sometimes the technology failed and so on. The fees that they were extracting was not high enough. So again, it failed, right? And this logic of making the financially sustainable, this again comes from the same capitalist logic that you build entrepreneurs, you give them loans so that they can buy computers, and then you help them become financially sustainable. But many of these things actually didn't pan out in practice, right? So what these papers again talk about is that projects, when they're marketed in this way, it can actually create new forms of dependency on technology of the global north, just entrench the ideologies even further. And but actually, many often times they may not work. Similarly, right, so these are all, right, if you just go deeper into the space of ICTs for development, right, that you provide people the technology, right, but ultimately, even if people are able to access the technology, very often they may not be able to use it to challenge oppressive political structures, right? So they will continue to operate within the existing structures, but not be able to realize many of the political liberties, right, freedom of principle, and so on. So if you, even though you may have access to the internet, you might be able to do social media and so on, but these platforms are not really free in the sense that they can be used for challenging laws that you may want to protest against, and right, other kinds of oppressive structures, right? So again, right, the point is that many of these technologies are projected as leading to development, but actually they may not be that useful, right? They may not actually be challenging these structures in a strong and meaningful manner. What we were just saying, that marginalized people, even if they're able to access social media, discussions are constrained at the local level only. They're not able to influence the decision making structures as such. Similarly, even when it comes to influencing policy for technology and development, that also is hindered for specifically these reasons. Policy, right, countering policy, changing policy is actually a political question. But very often these technologies are framed as neutral services, right, which might help with like people getting better access to health information and so on. But actually, they don't necessarily create that political change which you would need to eliminate poverty, or to really bring about meaningful development, right? So all of this is basically, again, right, giving examples of how, right from, right, what we were talking about of companies tendency to exploit people, or the state's tendency to control populations, how all of that is projected in different ways to create adoption, but actually it does not really create that emancipation and empowerment that it claims it will help achieve. Great. So now when it comes to, right, why also is it hard to counter, and to change this policy, change policies and so on, right, which continue to perpetuate existing structures, right? So C. Wright Mills was an American sociologist, and way back in '76 he wrote this book called The Power Elite, right? So here he talks about different, right, networks of the elite. And he basically explains that there are multiple stratas of society, multiple stratas in society, and ultimately it is the elite who are very well networked with each other, and their main goal is basically to preserve the status quo, right, even without actually collaborating formally with one another, but through all these social processes, it actually leads to entrenching of, and makes it difficult for these structures to be challenged, right? So it talks about many such layers, like local society, that at the local level there are people who run newspapers, radio stations, who run local factories, right? They're all intermingling with one another. They know one another and they don't challenge one another, right? Similarly, right, in the US they talk about, right, what used to be a social register of some 400 important families, elite families, and right, all of them went to places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so on. The very rich, right, similarly businessmen who have gained wealth, and now, right, they want to make their way into the metropolitan 400, or they've been managers and CEOs in companies. So again, it's these people who are actually in powerful positions to influence policy, to shape decision making. Then similarly, right, people from the military, political directorate, right, politicians, celebrities, and all of them basically are networked with one another. And what do they want? They basically want to preserve the status quo, right? And the status quo is what has been established through shared thinking, intermingling, coordination, appointments at the command post to ensure that new legislations, regulations, etc., do not enable an opposition to their position, right? And they also control political funding. So all of it therefore becomes one big nexus, which is not driven by values or any kind of an ideology as such, but mostly to profit and to keep doing, right, what they have been doing, to keep holding on to the power that they have. And as a result, the mass society, right, that gets more and more distant, and more non-consequential, which allows these structures to perpetuate, right? So this again brings us to the importance of media in a democracy, because it is only through media, and right, Fuchs shows that neither corporate control media nor social media is enough. You need new kind of counter media power so that you can reach the mass society, you can bust some of the myths through which these misleading ideologies are actually perpetuated. Yeah, right. So that's why, right, David Harvey, right, talks about neoliberalism as accumulation by dispossession, right? It's a political project. Citizens are dispossessed of income, wealth, and access to public services, yet they continue to accept these systems because of these misleading ideologies that are conveyed to them through media and all of these institutions. Yeah, and ultimately it helps the power elite to maintain the status quo, right? So this is basically now the how, right? The how of these structures as continuing to persist, right? And again, it brings us right back to highlighting the importance of democracy, right? That ultimately it is only democracy that can challenge these, and these systems are essentially trying to control democracy so that their position is not challenged. But whereas democracy is the only thing that actually can displace some of these exploitative systems and structures. And then connecting it back to the main topic of the course, that is actually this perpetuation of these structures, which enable technology, ethics in technology to not be embraced prominently, right? And which then leads to all sorts of other problems, right, that we've seen as technology leading towards. Yeah. So now how do we set this right, basically? So one way is, of course, regulation, right? But as we've seen, regulation is not easy. Now many proposals have, of course, been put up, right? So this particular proposal, for example, talks about how the public can be more involved in how technology regulations are built up, right? But again, this is more of a proposal by Dot Everyone, which is more of an activist kind of a think tank, right? That okay, these things can be done, but of course, right, we know that none of these things have actually been adopted in practice, right? So now, why then often regulations fail, right? So, right, regulations tend to again reflect the political economy within which they are centered. So, if you look at Uber, for example, now Uber is an international company, but the regulations in different countries are different. So, in the US, the Uber, a lot of the Uber drivers are actually freelancers. Therefore, the employer contractor question is the one which is important in the US because of the social security benefits. That it's done by freelancers, but they then are not entitled to social security, and social security in the US is provided by the employer. So that's why we see those right, the AB5 bill, for example, that we've discussed in the US as being one of the main issues of debate. However, in Sweden, social security is universalized, right? And taxation is more important in Sweden. So that is why in Sweden, the way Uber operates is very different. It is very regulated, and each and every transaction needs to be reported by Uber so that there can be no misreporting on taxation. And right, so they don't care much about the employer versus contractor question that we've seen. Rather, in Sweden, it's accepted as a useful service, right? But that is only because social security is universalized. So the government has keeps a very tight control. There's a very tight reporting system that Uber needs to comply with. This then helps the government raise taxes, right? Social security in general is taken care of by the government. In Germany, the local taxi unions were very powerful, and they did not allow regular gig economy operations. So in Germany, Uber is just like any other taxi operator, right? And right, so that again tells you how local the worker setups in Germany have been therefore useful. And that is why the regulations of how Uber is regulated in each of these countries is different. And therefore, the way these systems have also been challenged has been different. So in the US, there was this issue of employer and contractor, right? That's Uber has basically played up that it's very useful for innovation and improved efficiency, and it helps with consumer choice on the one hand, and it tries to suppress the rent seeking or competition stifling taxi operators that used to prevail earlier. So Uber has basically changed the narrative in the media in this way, so that it's able to continue operating in the employer slash contractor gray space. But in Germany, because the labor unions were strong, they basically settled it as a technical and legal matter. That well, if anybody wants to operate, they have to also comply with with the usual regulations that any of the taxi operators have to comply with, right? So the point being that regulations are right. One, they are shaped by the existing context in that particular country, and the history and other dynamics can shape this, right? Now, right, but at the same time, there is also manipulation that companies also do to shape the narratives, right? Which is what we saw over here, that companies can shape the narrative that technology is useful for innovation, for efficiency, and so on, just like we saw with technology for development. So it's the way that narrative is framed, which can also hamper new regulation from coming into the picture. Yeah. So now also Uber, there is another interesting case of how it also deflects and how it deceives the authorities. Right. So in the US, the regulator sometimes conducts sting operations, right, by actually trying to get an Uber ride, and then they monitor, right, various safety conditions, are the driver speeding, not speeding, and so on, right? Cancellations and what happens if they cancel their rides, and right, do they get the money back, and so on. So Uber actually at one time, it made a big registry of all government officials, and then it tried to actually examine that if any of them were actually trying to hail a ride, then it would give them a different service, just so that they would not catch any misbehavior, any malicious mal operations, right? So companies also then regularly try to flout efforts that try to regulate them. Another way in which regulation can also be imposed is through greater consumer awareness. So here there is this very nice platform called the Fair Work platform. So they basically do a survey of gig economy workers. So they've served, right, in India and several countries, they've been surveying workers on whether they get fair pay, right? That what kind of payments are they getting, and how long do they need to work? Is it in line with minimum wages in that country, right? What are the health and safety conditions that companies enable for their workers? Do they have proper contracts? Are they able to, in case of problems, are they able to complain to the management? Are they able to raise grievances? Do they have the right to organize in collective bodies and so on, right? So based on this, they come up with ratings, right? So they came up with a rating in 2019, then again in 2020, and they're about to release it for 2021. And so they're basically rating organizations like Zomato, Swiggy against each other, Ola and Uber against each other, and right, so on. So here the idea is that making these rankings and ratings more visible to the consumers can actually may drive the choices of consumers, right? That consumers, right, if let's say Flipkart is ranked higher than Amazon, then consumers may prefer buying from Flipkart instead of buying from Amazon, right? So right, so that's what they're trying to work with. So let's see how far that goes in terms of influencing consumer behavior, right? But that's another way, right? That basically by making this a factor in the consumer's decision making can actually possibly enable better ethical practices to emerge, right? But at the same time, we also see what's known as fair washing, right? Fair washing meaning that companies say that they're being more fair in their work, they're being right, they're giving fair pay, they have fair conditions, fair contracts, and so on. But actually, right, it's just meant to mislead the people. So here they give an example that Uber and other similar companies, they released a charter of good platform work, right? And actually they basically copy pasted from the Fair Work Manifesto, right? But with certain changes, right? So instead of saying that platform operators will have a responsible role towards ensuring the well-being and so on, they said, well, all stakeholders, including platform operators, governments, and the workers themselves, have a role, right? Workers classified as employees should earn the minimum wage, so they embrace that. But at the same time, they don't consider workers as employees themselves, right? Right. So these are basically ways in which companies and so on again try to deflect responsibility, or they try to again put up misleading representations, right? That by saying that they're actually being fair, but actually in practice they're not being fair as such. So these are essentially problems because of which, right, regulation is often not very effective. People can be misled, and then you can see, right, we'll see how far platforms like Fair Work are able to go, and similarly they can deceive authorities, and it really depends upon how these issues are framed for the government, for many of these regulations to come up in a meaningful manner. Yeah, right. So given all this, right, what other means are there, right, for companies to change, right? So one is collective action, right? That the workers themselves, they try and change the priorities of their companies. They try and argue for better working conditions and so on. So here also, however, we see that many different tactics are used by companies, right? So one is what we spoke about, right? Of this dualization of the labor market, right? Between contract workers and permanent employees, right? And both of these are positioned against each other, right? Because permanent employees are typically given better social security and everything, right? And therefore they also understand that it is important for contract workers to do a lot of the work, so because they get paid lower, and some of that surplus can be given to the permanent employees in the form of better social security. Yeah. So these are essentially ways in which even collective action on these platforms is can actually be threatened, right? So the technology also helps make all of this easier, right? By exercising control and so on. Yeah, right. And right. So that is why Uber has also always opposed regulations that give drivers the rights and benefits that are traditionally associated with employment, right? For collective action and so on. right? Further, on these platforms, right, when all the drivers are independent from each other, it means that it's harder for them to also collectivize. It's harder for them to mobilize and come together, right? Because they're all in different locations. On a shop floor, at least they work together, and therefore it helps them come together. It can help them come together for strikes and so on. But on these gig economy platforms, which is essentially atomize the operations, right, and it leads to a lot of individual behavior, this becomes very difficult. And representation is also much harder, right? So representation of these workers by unions or other forums is much harder, because worker interests may not always be aligned, right? Because there's a wide diversity. Some people are working full time, some are working as freelancers to top up their income, right? So just like the permanent and contract worker division, in the same way, there are many divisions between workers on these gig economy platforms, which makes their collectivization much harder. So mobilization is difficult, like we were saying. Majority of the protests have been against fare cuts, right? Where Uber or others, right, they may cut down the amount of money that's being charged. But even these protests have not been very successful, because it's hard for like mass strikes or boycotts to happen, right? Simultaneous log out events to happen. So that makes it difficult, right? And right, so there have been some cases, right, where in some areas, right, at a small scale, drivers working in different platforms have come together and mobilized, right? So they have their own WhatsApp groups, and which are formed at meeting points for drivers. And some of these protests, if they happen at visible places like outside the offices, it can create more media effect, right? So like in Italy, when one of these strikes happened, the media was also very sympathetic, and there was a wide public realization that the gig economy is the same as regular exploitation that has been happening. So there have been cases, but again, nothing very substantial has emerged, right? And largely is because, right, of just difficulty in many of these workers to really come together, as opposed to shop floor based unionization that would be easier to bring about, right, within factories. But over there again, we see that this rift between permanent and contract workers which are constantly on rotation, right, and they move from one factory to the other. So there's no, again, strong solidarity. There's not enough time for any of this strong solidarity to be built. And this is where labor laws and so on also come into the picture, right? Labor laws which say that you should not have, like in India, the labor law says that if a worker is employed for or on contract for more than 240 days in a year, then they should be made into a regular employee. So what companies actually do is that they rotate workers, and contract firms help do all this, and right, so that nobody is able to complete those 240 days, and they get rotated out, and and they move to a different factory. So all of that makes collectivization harder even on the shop floor, right? So again, we are seeing that these are various mechanisms, right, that anything which can emerge to challenge the existing structures, capitalist methods have, right, built mechanisms to counter all of them, right? So that collectivization is harder, regulation is harder, consumer awareness is harder, right, by controlling media. So all of this is therefore a problem. Yeah. So what sort of collective action mechanisms have emerged over here, right? So just very quickly, right? So some are, right, legal strategies, but they basically operate on individual levels, right? That one particular driver may put up a case, and that case may even lead to a good resolution, right? But attempts at class action lawsuits have not been very successful, right? So these basically address issues like worker misclassification, wage rates, access to loans, and so on. Yeah. Then there is more work which is typically led by unions, but they are looking at basically building up a wider base. And the challenge is that they over here, because all of these workers are what are called unorganized workers, right? They don't come under regular categories. So these are basically contractualized workers who are essentially said to be entrepreneurs themselves, self-employed workers, right? So these structures also don't exist as such, right? That a union for self-employed workers, right? That doesn't the government set up, like even in India, doesn't recognize such unions at all, right? Unions have to be affiliated with either a factory or some organized sector establishment, or similarly, right, at an industry sector in the organized space, right? But some of these, right, unorganized worker unions, the legal structures of what they can do, what they can accomplish, that is constrained. Right. Similarly, there are a couple of platforms that basically help gig workers come together and so on. But again, right, they don't have any legal power as such. They don't, right, they're not able to raise major issues. And then even companies have certain networks, right, which are built so that workers can come up and represent their issues and so on. But naturally, they then don't tend to take up these issues, right, like wage rates and so on. Over there, it's more, right, regular kinds of issues of trying to make sure that grievances and so on are being addressed, right, but nothing too significant. So, right, so essentially the point is that it's very difficult, right, in the gig economy space. Even this collectivization route to set things and to improve working conditions and everything are not that straightforward, right? So similarly, right, trade unions and so on, right, it's looking up towards them to change these existing structures is not very straightforward. So I'll just, yeah, okay. So let's try to complete this on collective action, and then we'll pick up next on Thursday, right? So there are other reasons also why collective action is hard, right? So Olson has a very famous book called Logic of Collective Action, which talks about other types of problems. So for example, when you have workers of different types, right? Permanent workers, contract workers, senior, junior, and so on, right? Temporary, casual, right? So it becomes hard to identify a common interest, right? And that makes it difficult, right? To build up the strength in numbers. Even if a common cause is identified, not everyone may voluntarily contribute, right? So like in strikes, we see that some people participate, but many others don't, right? So this is essentially called, right, also called free riding, that without actually putting in the effort or without incurring the costs, right, if you can still benefit, if some benefit is realized, then rationally speaking you would do that, right? Rationally speaking you would then not participate in these strikes, right? So that's why unions earlier used to be based on compulsory membership, that you have to pay to become a member, and then the union really works for your benefits, right? So Olson talks basically about why collective action is not that straightforward, because of these effects, right? That you might not be able to find some common causes, or even if you do, there are these free rider effects, which can actually prevent unions from becoming very powerful, right? At best, they might be able to work for certain types of issues, like access to bathroom facilities, right, and so on. But on wages and other kinds of like social security, unions may not be very effective, right? So essentially, potential of collective action will differ, right, from cause to cause, and right, context to context of where unions can really be useful. Yeah, cool. Yeah. So again, right, Graeber, we saw that he uses a different argument, that workers and lower income people tend to be more compassionate. That also blunts some of the force that they can actually muster. So they tend to empathize more with they tend to empathize with those who are in power, right? So that's a different argument. Not sure how strong it is, but yeah, this is where he talks about how when these structures are imposed top down, it becomes hard for workers to displace these structures, because they then tend to work within them and to embrace them rather than to protest against them. So basically, right, we've seen so far, we saw why surveillance and so on is built up, and then also we saw how these structures are perpetuated, right? We saw, right, how even collective action, which can possibly challenge these structures, can actually be impeded, right? So now next time in Thursday's class, which will be the last class now, we will look at some of these counter movements, that how have some counter movements started emerging, which can set this possibly as a means to set this right. Yeah.